In 2020, an area of land alongside the Jordan River, widely known as the West Bank, has once again become a focus of international attention because of a long-running dispute over its ownership. It is known to Jews as the biblical region of Judea and Samaria, a central part of their ancient homeland. There are two main questions at the center of this territorial dispute. Did Israel acquire control of the area by means of aggression? And does Israel have any rights to the land under international law? In part one of this series, we examine some of the key facts regarding the first question of acquisition by aggression. We now examine some of the key facts regarding the second question. The area has come to international attention again because of the political situation in Israel. In April 2020, after 3 general elections, Israel's politicians had still not been able to form a majority government. But the coronavirus pandemic finally prompted the leaders of the two main parties, Benny Gantz and Benjamin Netanyahu, to form a unity government. Their agreement included Benjamin Netanyahu's plan to annex parts of the West Bank as early as July 2020. That plan has caused controversy around the world. For example, on the 1st of May, a group of almost 130 British MPs and parliamentarians wrote to their Prime Minister, urging him to threaten Israel with sanctions if it went ahead with the plan. They claimed that annexation would be a serious breach of international law, quoting the UN principle that acquisition of territory by armed aggression is prohibited. But in part one of this series, we demonstrated that the Israelis were not the aggressors when they gained control of the territory. That calls into question the relevance of this United Nations principle, because it is not intended to cover the situation where territory is gained in a defensive war. But what of Israel's claim of their own legal rights to the land? Is that claim correct? On the 2nd of November 1917, the British government issued what became known as the Balfour Declaration, a letter by the Foreign Secretary Lord Balfour to Lord Rothschild, the unofficial leader of the British Jewish community. It said that they viewed with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and would use their best endeavours to facilitate its achievement. Over the following months, the British and their allies gained control of the region by defeating the Ottoman Turks in one of the main campaigns of the First World War. General Allenby entered Jerusalem on the 11th of December 1917, 2 days after the city surrendered to the British Army, having been abandoned by the Turks. After the First World War, the League of Nations was formed and agreed several mandates in conferences at San Remo in Italy in 1920 and 1922. Those mandates were designed to help the peoples of the Middle East form new self-governing states. The French were given a mandate for Syria and Lebanon to set up Arab-led states. The British were given a mandate for Mesopotamia, now known as Iraq, to set up an Arab-led state. And the British were also given a mandate for Palestine. The mandate for Palestine was different from the others. It acknowledged the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine and the grounds for reconstituting their national home there, which required facilitating the return of many Jews to the land. This mandate granted political rights in respect of Palestine to the Jewish people. The wording of the San Remo resolutions made these points explicit, and the word reconstituting is central to the whole issue, referring to the former state of Israel in that same land. Since Samaria, Judea, and Jerusalem were central to that previous Jewish national home, they were expected to be part of the reconstituted national home. But in 1921, the British exercised a special right under the mandate and split off 77% of the territory to form Palestine Transjordan as another Arab-led state. That left just 23% of the area available as a national home for the Jewish people. If the territory needed to be divided between Arabs and Jews, 77% should have been sufficient for the Arab people. Over the years that followed, the British hindered the development of a Jewish national home rather than helping it. On the 24th of August 1929, nearly 70 Jews were massacred in Hebron during Arab rioting, and scores were left seriously wounded. Afterwards, the British authorities decided to evacuate all of Hebron's surviving Jews, putting an end to a community that had existed for more than 3,000 years. In effect, an act of ethnic cleansing. Then there was the government white paper of 1939, which claimed that 450,000 Jews living in the land meant the intention of the Balfour Declaration had been met, and so restricted Jewish immigration to 15,000 people a year for the next 5 years. That left millions of Jews stranded in Europe when they were in desperate need of a refuge from Adolf Hitler's Nazi regime in Germany. The British government was widely accused of a flagrant breach of its obligations under the Mandate for Palestine. After the Second World War, the League of Nations was disbanded, and the mission of maintaining world peace was taken over by the new United Nations organization. Its charter placed the right of self-determination into international law, stating, "All peoples have the right of self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development." That statement seems clear, but it is not always easy to define a particular people. Another section of the UN Charter says, "Nothing in this chapter shall be construed in or of itself to alter in any manner the rights whatsoever of any states or any peoples, or the terms of existing international instruments." So the British Mandate for Palestine continued unchanged under the United Nations. But even after the Second World War and the Holocaust, the British authorities continued to restrict Jewish immigration. They treated many Jews as illegal immigrants and set up detention camps for them in Cyprus and in Palestine. One particularly troubling event involved an old ship trying to reach Palestine with 4,500 Jewish refugees on board. The SS Exodus was barely seaworthy, and yet Royal Navy ships rammed it and British Marines boarded, killing 3 people and wounding 10 others in the process. The British transported the refugees back to Europe and in due course returned them to Germany, the country they had fled. All of this led to conflict between Jews and the British authorities, causing the British to announce in 1947 their intention to withdraw from the mandate and hand over to the United Nations. Thus, in November 1947, the United Nations proposed a partition plan dividing the remaining 23% of the original mandate territory into 2 states, one for Arab Palestinians and one for Jewish Palestinians. Despite this plan cutting the Jewish state down to a small fraction of the original territory, the Jews accepted it, but the Arabs rejected it. Months of fighting between Jews and Arabs followed until the British withdrew on the 14th of May 1948 and the Jews declared the independent state of Israel. That state was immediately attacked by 5 Arab armies, but managed to defend successfully until Armistice Agreements were signed in 1949. Those agreements left the Golan Heights under Syrian control, the West Bank under Jordanian control, the Gaza Strip and Sinai Peninsula under Egyptian control. They also left most of Jerusalem under Jordanian control, including the Old City that they captured in 1948, driving out all its Jewish inhabitants. Arab leaders refused to recognize the armistice lines as national borders, hoping to eliminate the State of Israel in some future conflict. Thus, by 1949, a Jewish national home had been established and defended, but it was small, had no recognized borders, no peace agreements with its neighbors, and no access to Samaria, Judea, nor most of Jerusalem. It was also vulnerable to further attack, being overlooked by the Golan Heights to the north and being just over 9 miles wide at its narrowest point between the Mediterranean coast and the Jordanian-occupied region of Samaria. In these circumstances, it is untenable to claim that the Jewish national home had been reconstituted in accordance with the League of Nations resolutions made at San Remo. That situation changed dramatically in June 1967, when Israel was under great threat. The Israelis struck the Egyptian forces preemptively, and after just 6 days of fighting against 3 Arab armies, captured the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, Judea and Samaria, and the Golan Heights. 5 months later, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 242, which many people still quote when describing Israel's control of the disputed territory as illegal. It requires Israel to withdraw from all territory gained in the Six-Day War. But Resolution 242 also recognized the right of every state in the area to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries, free from threat or acts of force. Thus, it contains 2 conflicting requirements. Israel cannot withdraw from the disputed territory and have secure borders. To have a hostile state occupying a large area in the center of the land would leave Israel far too vulnerable to attack. When accusing Israel of illegal occupation, people also quote United Nations Security Council Resolution 2334, which reiterates a demand for Israel to immediately and completely cease all settlement activities in the occupied territory, including East Jerusalem. However, that resolution was adopted under the non-binding Chapter 6 of the United Nations Charter. It also overlooked a crucial fact. The Jewish people have done nothing to relinquish any of the rights that were bestowed upon them by the San Remo Resolutions in 1920 and 1922. They cannot occupy illegally land that is rightfully theirs. Furthermore, the validity of modern United Nations resolutions regarding Israel has become highly questionable due to an obvious bias. Israel is just one of 193 member states, but from 2012 through 2015, the United Nations General Assembly adopted 97 resolutions criticizing countries, 83 of which were against Israel. And from June 2006 through June 2016, the United Nations Human Rights Council adopted 135 resolutions criticizing countries, 68 of which were against Israel. That behavior is disproportionate in the extreme. The mandate for Palestine granted the Jewish people political rights to reconstitute their national home. It continued unchanged under the United Nations. The Jewish people have done nothing to relinquish any of the rights given in that mandate. UN Security Council Resolution 242 is impracticable because it places 2 conflicting requirements on Israel. UN Security Resolution 2334 is invalid due to obvious recent bias against Israel. The answer to the second of the 2 central questions regarding ownership of the disputed territory is that Israel does have rights to the land under international law. Those rights were granted by the League of Nations in the San Remo Resolutions of 1920 and 1922 and have not been changed or relinquished under the United Nations. It is, therefore, wrong to describe Israel's planned action as annexation. A country cannot annex territory that it rightfully owns. In part 3 of this series, we will move on to consider the biblical perspective on ownership of this disputed territory.